Hey there, Astromagic fans. I hope everybody has had a good past couple of weeks since we last saw each other, and now we're getting ready for the Aquarius new moon, which is also the beginning of the new year in the Chinese lunar calendar. So I hope everybody had a good year of the dog, and that the year of the pig is even more fortunate and prosperous for everybody. So for today's video, for the 2 weeks from this new moon to the full moon, we have 4 potential elections for astrological talismans. And I'm really excited to get into them because one of them is a planetary one, and the other 3 are lunar mansions. So planetary ones are often a little bit more difficult to come by, but so it's good that we get one for this upcoming period. Before we get into that, though, we need to do a little bit of a check-in on each of the planets and just kind of see where they're at, what they're doing, and how that can affect us as we're working with, ritual planetary magic and with talismanic magic specifically. So first we have the moon. She's going to move, from Aquarius over into to Virgo for the full moon there. And she'll move through Taurus and Cancer, her signs of exaltation and domicile. And lunar talismans are something that I actually wanted to kind of pause for a second and talk about, just because they are a little bit more different. They're a little different. And kind of more difficult in some ways. So you would think that, moon talismans would be relatively easy to get because you would have a lot of opportunities for them. The moon moves into Cancer and Taurus once a month, so out of a 28-day sidereal moon cycle, there are at least 5 or 6 days where she's in a sign that she's considered to be empowered. But it gets a little bit more tricky because there are certain aspects of the moon that are kind of more favored than others. One, obviously, moon talismans are going to be very susceptible to the moon phase at the time, because obviously, right? So that means if you're wanting, a waxing moon talisman or a moon talisman for like more lunar things, or for a sort of more beneficial spin or growth-oriented spin on the moon, then that's really going to cut out about half of the year when you could realistically do it. So you wouldn't want to do those while the moon is waning in Taurus, or while the moon is waning in Cancer. And since both of those signs are kind of on the same side of the zodiac, there's a good 4-month period where both of them are unavailable, and each of them are unavailable for, an additional 2 months on kind of either side of that. So you have basically half the year unavailable, or at least a whole 4-month period of it. And then moon speed is another part that's considered very heavily for moon magics. So you'll have to, consider that. And then typically when we do planetary talismans, you want the moon to immediately apply to whatever planet you're working with. So if you were making, say, a Venus talisman, you would want the moon to be immediately applying to Venus through some friendly aspect. But when you're doing lunar talismans, the moon can't apply to herself. So it's like, well, what do you do? And you kind of have to come up with other ways to work that in, or to work in, the planet that the moon is applying to. Obviously, you want that planet to be within kind of the same nature or parameters as whatever you want that lunar talisman to focus on. So you kind of have to consider that too. So moon talismans are a little bit more tricky, just because one of the factors that we always look to is no longer present. You have to find a workaround, and then, just kind of being unavailable for long periods of the year can make it difficult to do. So we won't have any opportunities for a moon talisman in this next 2 weeks, but it's one of those things that I'm kind of constantly on the lookout for, just because they do seem to be relatively rare. And that might sound kind of like a weird problem to have, like, oh no, the moon's unavailable for talismans a few months a year. When you have planets like Saturn, who once he moves out of Aquarius in a couple of years, we won't have really any more talismanic options until he gets into Libra, which will take another 20 years after that. So, stock up while you can. But the moon kind of has a similar problem. Everybody kind of has a similar problem that you're kind of working with. But the moon's is more phase involved, whereas everybody else tends to be more dignity involved, what sign they're in. So the moon will move through Aquarius to Virgo. We're not really going to have opportunities for moon talismans in this 2-week period. Mercury is going to move into Pisces during this 2-week period, and that's not something we're going to work with. Pisces both is the detriment and the fall of Mercury, which I know a lot of people think is weird to have a double up, but it's fine. Go with it. Then we have Venus, who is newly into Capricorn, and Capricorn isn't a sign that Venus does well in, per se, so that's not something we're really going to focus on. And of course, we have Venus applying to the conjunction of Saturn soon, which is also not going to make things great. Afterwards, she'll be going to the square of Mars, so Venus has kind of a rough road ahead for her. The Sun will just be in Aquarius, which is his detriment, so we're not going to worry about him for a little bit. The Sun, in general, isn't going to be a planet we're going to focus on really until he gets to Aries, his sign of exaltation, so we're just kind of waiting for March to do really anything solar. Now, for Mars, he's actually in his domicile of Aries, but is still kind of within that square aspect with Saturn and Capricorn, so we really don't want to do a whole lot of Mars things right now, just because that Saturn kind of dampens him out. And then kind of make things worse, as we get closer to the full moon, Mars will actually ingress into a sign of detriment, Taurus. So we're not going to be doing much with Mars for a little bit until we get out of this kind of part of the zodiac. Jupiter, thankfully, is still happily placed in his domicile of Sagittarius. He'll be there for a little while, so we still have some time to work with him for whatever we need. And there is actually an opportunity for a Jupiter talisman in this 2-week period, so look forward to that when we move into our talismanic section. And then finally, we have Saturn in Capricorn, which is something we're going to be dealing with for, a little while longer, for about another year. But right now, he's kind of within that square of Mars also, so we're kind of going to pull back from Saturn until Mars gets into Taurus, and then we'll be able to focus more on Saturn, kind of without Mars's more difficult influence. So that's sort of our overview of what's going on with the different planets right now and how they'll be used or not used, or just utterly avoided and dreaded in different talismanic works. But let's go ahead and move on to our talismanic elections that we have for this 2-week period. We are going to start with a Jupiter in Sagittarius talisman. Alrighty, so our first electional chart for today is going to be one for a Jupiter planetary talisman. Now, planetary talismans have a little bit more pomp and circumstance around them and a little bit more specificity around what makes them good or what makes them bad, kind of those kinds of things. Kind of setting the base for this we've got Jupiter here strong in the angular 10th house in his sign of domicile Sagittarius, looking good so far. The moon is in Pisces, and is going to be applying a square to Jupiter immediately. Now, squares are typically not ideal aspects to have in planetary magic or in talisman making, but squares with benefic planets, Jupiter and Venus, those are fine, and then especially if you can get what's called reception on top of it. And reception is what happens when one planet, in this case the moon here, applies an aspect to another planet, like Jupiter here, from that second planet's sign of domicile or exaltation. So what that means is, if you have the moon here, and she's applying to Jupiter here, by any aspect really. But she's applying to Jupiter from one of Jupiter's signs, like Pisces, or even Sagittarius, or even even Cancer, because that's Jupiter's exaltation, then that is reception. Jupiter receives the moon, and it's a much stronger, more personable connection than without reception. So the second piece of this is that at this time, it's right around sunrise on a Thursday. So this is both Jupiter's day and Jupiter's hour happening. So this is just a really strong time filled with this really potent, benevolent, giving Jupiter energy. And it's really good to be able to kind of capture that and keep it for, the rainy days ahead of us. This will put Mercury and the Sun in the first house or on the ascendant. And it's not so bad. Ideally, you will kind of want to keep planets out of the ascendant, but because these two planets don't rule particularly difficult houses, 4, 5, and 7, with Virgo being intercepted in the 7th, it's not hateful, we'll call it. It's not a bad thing. It would be worse if, say, Venus, the Lord of the 8th house, or Saturn, the Lord of the 12th house, were in the first house. That would be a much more kind of difficult thing. And in this instance, we do have Saturn ruling the first house from the 11th house. So there's a lot of, good kind of protective things involved. Kind of the thing you have to worry about with this chart is that Saturn is still kind of experiencing the square with Mars. It's separated. We got like over 10 degrees between them, but it's still kind of there, still kind of touching base, kind of tangentially. So just something to keep an eye out. I'll definitely put the materials necessary for Jupiter talismans, kind of what you want to look for or get together, on this side of the screen here, like I do for all the other talismans. And this is something that you want to kind of get started immediately at sunrise, and to kind of wrap up about 15 to 20 minutes later. So that wraps up our first election for our planetary Jupiter talismans. The planetary talismans are a little bit more difficult to get just because they're a bit more involved and require a little bit more specificity. So definitely grab them up if you need them when the opportunities arise. But if you wait about an hour later, we also have an opportunity for a 28th Mansion talisman. And this is one that we've talked about a couple of times before in past videos, just because of how the planets are situated right now. Like Jupiter is in a square aspect to this mansion, basically. So whenever the moon is in this mansion, there's a really good chance that she's going to be applying this square with Jupiter. And Jupiter's a really great planet to have, kind of involved with the 28 Mansion talisman, just because his signification of growth and stabilization, his sort of natural powers basically, go so well with or synergize with the 28th Mansion talisman, which is all about, accumulation and growth and wealth. So we have the same thing happening here today that we've had several times before, where you have the moon here in the first house, within the confines of the 28th Mansion, applying this square to an angular in domicile Jupiter. So this is just another really great opportunity for the 28th Mansion talisman if you weren't able to pick it up in previous opportunities. Both the moon and Jupiter are averse to Mars and Saturn here, and neither of them afflict the ascendant in any real way. Jupiter is also the lord of the first house, so this is just another really great opportunity for the 20th Mansion, like I said, if you weren't able to pick one up before. Alrighty, so our third election and our second Lunar Mansion election for this 2-week period is going to be one for the third mansion of the moon. And the third mansion of the moon is honestly one of my favorites. It was one of the first talismans that I ever really made, and I always look forward to the period of time when the moon is waxing in this mansion, just to be able to make more. And so this one is a little bit different from how I typically do Lunar Mansion talismans. So that's sort of the disclaimer there. As you guys can see, the moon is here in the 11th house, which is not, angular, which is how I usually try to get the moon. But I didn't want to miss this conjunction with Mars. The third mansion of the moon is all about accumulating all good things. So it's a really great kind of go-to mansion for kind of anything that you really need that is, for you, or like really growth or positive oriented. Excuse me. So that's one of the reasons why you want to wait for the waxing moon, and then having the moon apply to a fortunate or well-placed planet is another part of that. Mars is not necessarily what we consider a fortunate planet, but when Mars is in his domiciles or exaltation, he behaves much more evenly handed. He has much more materials to do things with, and he is a much more sort of pleasant person to work with. So I really wanted to grab a hold of this conjunction of Mars and the moon within the third mansion for a third mansion talisman, but because it's in the 11th house instead of the 10th house, it doesn't quite have the punch that these talismans usually have, which is unfortunate, but the way it is. In this instance, we've got the final degree of Gemini on the ascendant, which points us to Mercury as the lord of the first house. And this is a planet that you typically want to take good care of. Unfortunately, Mercury has slipped into his detriment and fall of Pisces at this time, which is not super great. He's far enough away from the sun to be no longer combust, which is great, and coming out of combustion is much better than going into combustion. But he is not harshly aspected. He's unafflicted by both Mars and Saturn. So this isn't what we would call a necessarily comfortable place for Mercury, but it's not a game breaker as far as this goes. But it is, like I said, kind of atypical for how we typically do Lunar Mansion talismans. So if you aren't comfortable doing it, then don't, obviously. But this is sort of a desperation attempt, we'll call it, to try to grab a third mansion talisman while we still can. So this final election that I wanted to show you guys is going to be an election for the 11th mansion of the moon, which is all about victory, success, attainment of goals or offices. So it can be really great for people seeking promotion or trying to find that next thing in like their freelancing career or just anything like that. Like, what's that next step up for me? The 11th mansion is really good for. And I wanted to show you this one. It's not what I would call a great election for this mansion, but it's also kind of a desperation one, because it's really unfortunate to miss this trine with Jupiter, which will happen to planets in the 11th mansion. So as you can see from the chart here, we have the moon in Leo and on the ascendant within the 11th mansion, and she's immediately applying a trine to Jupiter in Sagittarius, like only a difference of 35 minutes of arc are between this. Is between this. The Lord of the first house becomes the sun in Pisces, and it's really fun because this is a chart set for 5:05 p.m. But if you go to just 2 minutes before at 5:03 p.m., the sun is in Aquarius. So this is kind of a really interesting chart because it's like the sun immediately moves from his sign of detriment to Pisces, a sign that he's not quite so burdened in. And then you can also get this moon Jupiter trine with the moon in the 11th mansion. So there's some really fun symbolism there involved. This isn't necessarily a great mansion chart just because this opposition with the moon and the sun are so close. You typically want to keep them about 15 to 20 degrees apart from one another. So this could be not a really great election for it, even though there is some really nice stuff kind of wrapped up in it or woven into it that could make it potentially really useful. But this opposition between the sun and the moon at the time really takes a lot of punch out of the moon just because of how forceful the sun is to her at this time. So it's a fun election just because of how quick the sun changes, and then you have the Jupiter moon trine so tight within it, but it's probably one that I wouldn't really recommend people use, especially newer individuals. Alrighty, everyone. So those are the 4 election charts that I had to share with you for this 2-week period. And I hope everybody is able to get something out of these elections, whether it's just more knowledge or more practice with how to elect for yourself, or some relief from some issue that you've been facing or some pressure in your life from the talismans themselves. But that's all that I have for you for today. I'll see you guys at the Virgo full moon, and I hope everybody has a wonderful year of the pig.